Good evening to all of you. Thank you for coming out on a Friday night. I remember the days, and I think many of you do, when Friday night was a big meeting night at church. But maybe because life has become very busy, we like to stay home. So I'm glad to see you. I'm also glad to be local. There are not a few occasions during the year when I get invitations that require 4 or 5 hours of driving. And here I only had to come across town to a familiar place. So it's always a bit of a challenge to talk on the subject of marriage publicly, because not only is the subject pretty broad, you have very different situations persisting amongst those who come to hear. Some people have been happily married for a long time and are happy they're married. Some wish they were married. Some wish they were not married. And maybe I should stop there before I get into trouble. There are a lot of different possibilities that might be found in a room where the subject of marriage is spoken about. This evening I'm going to talk kind of globally about marriage. I'm going to talk in a very comprehensive manner. In other words, I'm going to be taking a flyover visit to marriage, because I think it's very helpful sometimes to look at marriage from a high altitude, if you know what I mean. And by the way, I'm up here in the middle of an electronic jungle. I'm actually running a computer or two, and I have stuff around me, but I tend not to be electronically fascinated. Is that okay to say it that way? So we'll work our way through here. But I'm also using slides, visual slides, and I like them sometimes and I don't like them sometimes, because once you create them, then they determine what you have to say, and I don't always like to have it determine what I'm going to say next. So we will work our way through here, I think, without any big problem. If I were to give you an outline for what I'm going to talk about tonight, it would be this, is that the areas that I want to talk about, and you understand with a list that long that it'll probably be a little bit on each one of these. But I want to look at definitions of marriage, and then I want to ask the question, what should I bring to marriage if I want to be well married? And then I'm going to spend some time talking about the prevailing ideas of marriage and why that's important. And then I'm going to talk about marriage as a relationship. I'm going to talk about the Christian part of marriage. What is it makes a marriage Christian? And then we'll get to the nuts and bolts of marriage, and I'm going to end this evening by spending a little bit of time on issues of conscience. So if you're all good to go, I think we'll roll along. I want to begin by sharing with you some definitions or partial definitions that I think of marriage that I think are very good and very helpful. And one of them is this one: the trading away of personal autonomy in exchange for a journey into mutuality. It's a journey from I to we. Now, in saying that, you realize that this little snippet, if I can call it that, runs very much contrary to the ethos of our time, where we are fascinated by autonomy. We like to envision societally, we like to think of each one of us as an autonomous person, and that we ought not to have any restrictions put on us except those that we choose for ourselves. If that's your mindset, I would suggest you don't get married, because marriage is the trading away of personal autonomy, and in exchange you get to enjoy mutuality, or what I sometimes call spousal support, which comes in many, many different ways, including advice that you might not want to listen to sometimes. Another one, that marriage is the bringing together of two different people who persistently take up the task of growing toward each other through all the circumstances of life. Doesn't that sound exciting? It is exciting, most of the time. But you notice here that the emphasis on the fact that there are two different people. Culturally, we tend to think that it's two similar people who get married. The truth is, it's different people. And I was reading a book a while ago, and the author made an astonishing statement. He says, you never marry the right person. Never. I think he's correct. There is no such thing as the right person. There are some better people and some less better people, but the right person doesn't exist. When people get married, it's two different people, and they take up the task of growing toward each other through all the circumstances of life. And then this third one, it's the enjoyment of sameness and the persistent management of difference. Now I'm going to be bold and tell you these are all things that Dave Thomas wrote, all three of these sayings. So I haven't put my name on them, but I teach a class on this subject at the university, and in dialoguing with students, I have found these three statements to be very, very helpful. That it is true that there is a certain sameness that people enjoy in a relationship, and that doesn't require any work. You enjoy that sameness, but you will also discover difference, and successful marriage involves the persistent management of difference. Here's one of my favorite, I think this is my favorite definition of marriage. It comes from a Mennonite scholar, Elton Trueblood, who is what was a very fine gentleman. He is now in his grave, but he had some very interesting books. He was a very devout man and a good, gentle scholar. But back in I think this is in the 50s, as I recall, he and his wife sat down, at his wife's suggestion, they sat down and wrote a book about marriage together. And in that book, there was a time in my life when I collected books, old books on marriage, because they're very different from new books on marriage. But in reading this little book, I came across this, and I've loved this definition, that a successful marriage is not one in which two people beautifully matched find each other and get along happily ever after because of this initial matching. It is instead a system, notice that it is a system, by means of which, and I added the word different persons who are sinful and contentious are so caught up by a dream and a purpose that they work through the years in spite of repeated disappointment to make the dream come true. I like this because it talks about marriage as a system that allows two people who are different and inherently sinful and inherently selfish, that they get caught up by a dream. And you notice that the overall picture of this is it's a durable dream. It's something that plays out over a long period of time. See, so that's, if you want to know what my favorite definition of marriage is, it would be that one right there. So I switch then to the question, what to bring to marriage. If you want to be married, and you want to be well married, if I can use that phrase, what do you bring? The first thing I would suggest is you bring a long-term settled desire to be married. Marriage is not for the curious. See? It's not for those who want to try it out. It's not for people who want to experiment. See? If you want to be happily married, you need to come to that idea with a long-term settled desire to be married. And I threw in there that if you happen to come from a home with a long-term marriage that created your example and ideal, that's a very good thing. And if you happen to have parents who are in a long-term marriage, you might want to thank them for the example they gave you, because you saw how over time a marriage works and how it lives. See? So that's the first thing I would list. A second thing is that you need to be relationally well. Now, a lot could be said about this, and I'm not an expert on this because I don't have any formal training in personality analysis and professional counseling. I have street smarts when it comes to this, if you allow me to say it that way. But there are a few general things that I think should be known that make up relational wellness. First of all, no significant unhappy residues from previous relationships. I'm not saying that if you've had previous relationships, there is no hope for you in marriage. That's not my point at all. My point is that there should not be any lingering unhappy residues, that you should have found a way to process those so that they don't sit in the forefront of your life anymore, that they're in the background of your life. Secondly, being relationally well means you have a willingness to be vulnerable and transparent. If you want to be happily married, you have to risk revealing who you are and what's dear to you and how you like life to go. See? You need to be emotionally stable, and I don't know how you're going to measure that, because what's emotionally stable to some people is volatile to others. But I suppose emotional stability could be measured by at least a sameness in between those two people. At least they should occupy the same ground. The ability to bond with another person, and here this is a surprise to a lot of students, especially in their early years, because people today are delaying marriage. I think the average age of marriage today is about age 27. And people who study human bonding will tell you that the older you get, the more difficult it is to bond deeply with another person. That if you are in your early 20s, bonding takes place the quickest and the deepest. See? That doesn't mean you cannot bond at a later period. It just means that when you're in your early 20s, before the concrete has set above the eyes, you know, I'm simply saying that as we get on into life, our habit patterns and even our thought patterns and our ideas become quite fixed. Whereas when we're younger, they're more pliable. And one of the best times to get married is when you're transitioning from your schooling into your professional world. That seems to be a very good time. And the last one I would mention, the ability to manage anger well. And perhaps what I'll say here tonight is that it's a very significant day when you realize that anger is something you choose to manifest. Nobody can make you angry. They can only do things that cause you to choose to be angry. And the way people manage anger is very interesting, because anger is actually a very valuable emotion, but it's a very dangerous one. And there are people who learn in relationships that if they get angry and blow up, then they get their way. And, you know, anger can be a source of manipulation, and none of us like to deal with angry people. So to be happily married, you need to be married to somebody who knows how to manage anger well and without it going up into the stratosphere. Another thing you should bring to marriage if you want to be well married is you need to be free of major encumbrances. I list, first of all, no active addictions. And if any of you have worked with people or had family members who have addictions, you understand what I'm talking about here. That addiction, and a serious addiction, does not allow you to participate in life in any meaningful way. And therefore, if you have an addiction, and I would even include addictions to computers, you know, if they absorb you so that you don't have relational time, you're best not to get married. And I could actually tell you some stories, but I won't tell them, of people who, I will tell you one. I had one situation where an engaged couple, the young man told his fiancée not to come by on one day a week because that was his game day. And I thought to myself, well, if that were my situation, I would have a little chat and I would say, look, if we are going to be married, there is no day when I'm not welcome. And if there is such a day, then maybe we need to talk about some other thing. It's helpful if you're financially stable and don't have a lot of debt, unless, of course, you're marrying somebody who's very wealthy and is willing to pay for your debts for you, then that's great, see. No serious legal entanglements. You know, I marvel sometimes at the willingness of people to marry when there are enormous legal entanglements, sometimes even including a journey to prison. No secret relationships. And there's also the question of children. If you have children at home, they statistically are one of the most complicating factors in subsequent marriages. So I'm not saying if you have a child you cannot get married. I'm saying that you have a lot more to negotiate. It can be done, but don't just assume it's going to work on its own. See? And then this one, be a good person and marry a person of good character. These things are so obvious, I'm almost embarrassed to put them up here for you tonight. But, you know, if you want to be happily married, it's very helpful if you marry somebody in whose life the good graces are already present. See, if you get married, you're not going to grow those in your spouse. See, they have to grow them themselves. So I'm talking about kindness, gentleness, honesty, integrity, and love. That if you want to marry well, the person you marry should be exhibiting those things. In the here and now, they should be visible. I think the capacity to delay gratification is a very important element too. It used to be in the Protestant world we had a lot to say about delaying gratification, that self-discipline and delaying gratification were instruments that would get you to a much better future. Today, we want everything now, and I sometimes chuckle that some of us had grandmothers who used to work for 2 and 3 hours in front of a wood stove making supper. We now stand in front of the microwave and tell it to hurry up, you know, and we don't delay gratification. But even relationally, in marriage, delaying gratification is a very significant thing. How about unselfishness manifested as a characteristic of life? See, that the person you want to marry should be manifesting not for your benefit, but merely as a quality of life and character that they have adopted for themselves, this idea of unselfishness. See? And then the presence of the ability to keep commitments or to persevere, I call that grit. You know, in many ways life is tough and you have to have some grit. If you get knocked down, you have to get up again and you have to start walking again. And I think that's true relationally as well. Understand that when you get married, marriage does not change people just because they got married. That I tell students that if you marry a kind person, guess what you get to do? You get to live with a kind person. Now, if you marry a snarky person, someone who's always cutting you down with acerbic humor, guess what you get to do for the rest of your life? Yeah. If you marry a liar, guess what you get to do? You know, there's no magic to this. See? And so looking for these qualities, I think, is a very, very significant and an important thing. Okay. And then this one, religious settledness. I talk a lot about religion in my profession now. And I would invite you to think about how many things in your life are affected by the religious beliefs you hold. See? In fact, I'm wondering if you could put anything on a list. Could you create a list of things that are not affected by your religion? See? It's pretty hard to come up with anything that's not affected. Now, you realize then that if you are marrying somebody and you're going to live in the same space and occupy the same sphere of existence, that if you have significant differences in either religious practice or religious belief, that at a very profound level you're going to be at odds. This is why the Apostle Paul said not to marry unbelievers. He wasn't saying that they were mean and nasty people. He's just saying that in every sphere of your life that's affected by your belief, you are likely to be at odds with the other person. And so I list these things. Religious ideals and commitments should be well formed. Issues of conscience should be known and shared. If you have an issue of conscience, don't hide it from the person you want to marry. There should be little difference between profession and practice, and your belief system should be similar. I list these all as what I would call a boilerplate. I think it's stuff that if you never thought about it before you married, you would have to think about it after you got married, because it would be put in your face quite dramatically. So I shift to my next element. I've talked about marriage, what it is. I've talked about what we might bring to marriage if you want to be married well. But I want to talk now for a while about marriage as an idea. And these thoughts came to me some years ago, and they seemed to be so obvious it surprised me that I hadn't thought about them many years ago. But the truth is that before marriage is anything, it is a collection of ideas, and we have collected these ideas from many places and in many ways. We've collected them from our parents, we've collected them from society, from movies that we thought were marvelous, from books that we've read, from who knows where we get these. And we assemble them all. And we cherish them because they describe to us a preferred future. The reason you get married is because you have some ideas and you think that by marrying you will be assisted toward your preferred future. See? Now, if both people in a marriage hold compatible ideas about marriage, they will discover that they enjoy a deep-seated commonality. They will sense themselves working toward a common goal. It will be like putting on a well-worn glove. Have you ever done that? Sometimes when I go out to work in the yard, I put on gloves, and I tell you, I love a well-worn pair of gloves. I would pick them over a new pair any day, unless they have holes in them, see. Yeah. Now, if people hold incompatible ideas, even if the ideas are not quantified and they're not voiced, the couple will find themselves strangely at odds, like they are surreptitiously working toward different ends. And if you don't understand the marital concepts that exist in your relationship, you won't even be able to describe why this tension exists. It just seems like you don't fit together. Why don't we fit together? We can't really tell. So I want to spend a few minutes here talking about some of the marital concepts that exist, and I have, I think, 12 of them here. And I don't know if you can see the list from there. I'll just run down it quickly. Patriarchal, hierarchical, polygamous, androgynous, economic contract, big event, 50-50, magical matching, brittle social contract, common good, civil rights, and covenantal. And that one economic contract I came across just recently. I used to have 10 of these, now I have 12 of them, and I'm sure there are a few more. Now some of these, and what I mean by these, that these words, these little titles, describe different concepts about what constitutes marriage. Some of them have no relevance in the society in which we live. There's no polygamy in our society that I know of, at least not officially. I don't think there's as much economic contract marriage. I doubt there's much androgynous marriage. But some of these are very much in play in our culture, and I'm going to go through some of the ones that I think are more relevant to us. And I begin with patriarchal. Patriarchal is an old form of marriage like you read about in the Old Testament, where you have a patriarch, you have a man, and he acquires a wife. Sometimes patriarchal marriage is polygamous. You get 3 or 4 wives. And in patriarchal marriage, it is the interests of the male that are primary. And the goal in society is for a man's family to be perpetuated. You have ancestors behind you, you have your family now, and your task is to project your family into the future. And lineage is traced through the man for a simple biological reason. If you talk to people who are in patriarchal systems, they will tell you, well, it's obvious, the man has the seed of life. And so obviously it must be his family. And women in this system are highly prized, but they have to fit into narrow societal parameters. Okay? A woman is acquired as a bride with a bride price. And if you want to go the patriarchal route, I would just encourage you not to do it the way they do it in India, where the bride pays the groom's family for marriage. In most places, the groom pays the bride's family for marriage. So make sure you do it that way and not the other way. Unfortunately, in India, there are many brides who are suffering because the husband then after marriage comes to her family and says, well, you didn't really give me a good deal. You told me this and you told me that, but my wife can't do those things, so I need more money. It doesn't seem to do as much the other way, and I'm being a little facetious here, but the main function of patriarchal marriage is not personal intimacy, but what do I want to say here? The continuation of a family, and so the single most important event in a patriarchal marriage is the birth of a son. And that's true for both the man and the woman. If when a son is born, there's great rejoicing because that is kind of the guarantor that the family will continue. And it's a very embarrassing thing for a family to face the reality that it's not going to continue because under your watch no son was born. And I remember being in a country where patriarchal marriage persists years ago, and I met a man with his family. He was traveling with his family. He had 13 girls, 13 daughters. And his wife was pregnant again. And what did I know immediately? Got to have a boy, see? And I don't know, of course I wasn't around to see what happened, but I suspect if that next child was a boy, it would have been the most highly prized, see? Interestingly, in patriarchal marriage, divorce is very easy. but it's very uncommon. See, it's very uncommon. It's a prevailing form of marriage in many parts of the world today, and I think I probably said enough about it. I talk about hierarchical marriage, and this one you'll be more familiar with. This idea of marriage prevails in conservative Christian circles, and it has a theological basis. It is actually anchored in the Genesis 3 narrative where Eve sinned and then Adam. And according to this idea that because of that event, because Eve sinned first, that God gave headship to the man. And that now there's a new economy, that because of sins coming and the way it came, that God has told the woman that it is part of her religious obligation to be in a subservient position to her husband. And this is the kind of marriage where you often hear quotes about wives submit to your husband. See? But understand that the root justification for this is a religious one. Because Eve sinned first, she was made subservient according to Genesis 3, or that interpretation of Genesis 3, and so now her religious duty is to live in a submissive manner for the rest of her life. Okay. My opinion of hierarchical marriage is pretty poor. It's a mistaken understanding, I think, that opens the way for authoritarianism and the easy abuse of wife and children. I will tell you that there are some conservative Christian organizations, the Southern Baptists I'm thinking of, who actually voted this model of marriage as their preferred model at a general conference session. See, I think it's a misunderstanding of Scripture myself, but we can talk about that another day. There's also now 50-50 marriage. It used to be more popular in the 60s because it was an egalitarian model for marriage that envisioned husbands and wives as equals, and that they were to contribute equally to this marriage. And the goal here is that nobody should have to contribute more than 50%. And so in 50-50 marriages, there's a lot of time spent negotiating. There's a lot of time keeping track of who did what when. I cooked supper last night, so my wife's going to cook it tonight. I took out the trash last time, she's going to take it out the next time. You know, I knew some people when I was in college who I would say were in a 50-50 marriage, and they used to drive me a little bit nuts, because they actually spent more time keeping track of things and negotiating things than it would have taken to actually do the thing. But yeah. The nice thing about this concept of marriage is its egalitarian nature, but it can be problematic because adherents to it tend to invest only 50% in the marriage. I give 50%, my wife gives 50%, and there we have 100%. What's missing from the equation is the 50% that each one does not invest. You know, that adds up, as one person said, sometimes to trouble. Oh, I need to keep pushing my buttons here, don't I? Another form of marriage that exists in America, particularly amongst more elite societal circles, is this idea of marriage as a brittle social contract. You know, the idea is that people grow and change, and in consequence, nothing is permanent, not even marriage, and so marriage is envisioned as a brittle social contract. It's necessary and it's a decent thing to do, but you have to understand it's not going to last probably more than 10 or 12 years. And therefore you set this up. When you get married, you understand that about a decade or maybe 15 years from now, you'll be going through a divorce because you'll have grown apart. And so sometimes people set up prenuptial agreements, they set up advanced divorce directives, they talk about amicable breakup, and then the idea is that after you've been married the first time and that breaks up, you then marry the second time, and when that breaks up, you marry a third time, and then when you get old, you marry a fourth time. See? And the first time you marry for sex and excitement, the second time you marry for family, the third time you marry for maybe financial stability, and the fourth time you need to marry somebody who will take care of you when you get old, you know, that kind of thing. See? And there are people, you know, this is not an uncommon view of marriage. It's not an uncommon one. I talk about magical matching. This is the most prominent idea in America about marriage. The idea that somewhere out there is a one and only person, a soulmate, and in Christian circles we say, yes, and it's somebody that God has chosen for you. You just have to go and look and find that person. And the key to thriving in this concept of marriage is to find that person. Now, how you go about finding that person is a very anguished business. See, you look for them. Is this the right one? You date? No. See, And the understanding is that if I just happen to find that person, then marriage is all joy and it's no work. It will just happen on its own. It'll be all peaches and cream. I would like to drop a small incendiary device on that idea. Okay? Because I can just tell you that idea is, how shall I say, it's nonsense. Okay? It's fantasy. And I would say it is one of the core reasons, first of all, for no marriage or late marriage, and secondly, for a high divorce rate in America. Because what happens is we get married thinking, I found the right one, and then you discover some difference, and the conclusion you come to is, uh-oh, I made a mistake. If I had found my soulmate, there wouldn't be this problem. And so when you're playing matching games, you don't fix a matching game, you bail out of it and you start another one. And I've actually talked to people who have done this 5 times and they still can't figure out what's wrong with those other people. See? Well, the truth is that the idea they have for marriage is unrealistic, and if you have unrealistic expectations in marriage, don't be surprised if they're not met. They cannot be met. See? Another one that I talk about briefly is marriage as a civil right. This is a new concept of marriage that is built on the idea that since marriage conveys certain legal and social rights and privileges, that it is discriminatory to allow it only to certain people. So the definition of marriage should be expanded to allow any consenting adults to marry. Okay? No parameters should be put on this other than that these 2 people agreed to get married. See? This is a very recent idea that's still being worked out, and it's going to be interesting to see how it does play out, because if it's discriminatory to limit marriage to 2 people, it's also discriminatory to limit it to 3. I mean, if it's, well, I think you understand what I'm saying. If it's discriminatory to limit it to only 2, then how many can be in a marriage? Lots of interesting thoughts about this one, but I leave that one for now. This one I put in because it's an unfortunate one, but there are not a few thoughtless people today who conflate the idea of a wedding with marriage. In other words, if the goal in life is to have a ceremony. Everyone deserves their day. So you get married and you have a big event, and then after that you ask yourself, oh, now what's marriage? See? I don't have a clue, but didn't we have a great time? See? And I am surprised in an unhappy way how many people actually do this. They get all excited about a wedding, and then afterwards they say, oh no, what did we do? Oh yeah, we have to figure out now how to live together. See? The last one I'll talk about here is this one, covenantal, and I would argue that this is the primary Christian concept of marriage. It's the idea that a man and a woman make a solemn pledge called the covenant, and they both see themselves bound by this covenant that has both vertical dimensions to God and horizontal dimensions to humans. Okay? The understanding in the covenant is that the people who are getting married are not nicely matched. They have some commonalities and they have love, but they understand that they have difference. And I think that we are very familiar with this because the whole legal structure of marriage is built around covenantal marriage. You make pledges and you make vows, and you all know the traditional vow for better and for worse and rich and poor and all those things. That those are societally created covenantal elements. But the focal point of this is that whether you're the husband or the wife, your first responsibility in marriage is to be loyal to the covenant. Okay? And that covenant sits in the middle of life. It's a very realistic model in a broken world because it accommodates difference, and a covenant is something that you can be loyal to and you can work to adjust if necessary. So I'll say more about that some other time. So I talk about these different models for the following reasons. What do you think happens if somebody who subscribed to marriage as a brittle social contract marries a person who thinks of marriage as a covenant? How's that going to work? See? Or think of this one. What if somebody who's a 50-50 marrier marries somebody who's patriarchal? You understand my point here? is that many of these ideas of marriage are absolutely incompatible, and if two people marry across those lines, they're in for trouble at a very foundational level, and they won't always understand why. So I encourage people, if you want to marry well, spend some time finding out what a person thinks constitutes marriage. Well, what is your idea of marriage? I've discovered that that's not as easy a question to answer as we might like to think. I've had many couples come to me for premarital counseling, and I ask them to come back next week having identified their model of marriage, and they come back and they say, we don't know what you're talking about. See? Because in our lives, these models are givens. We just assume that since I see marriage this way, my wife will see it that way too. Truth of the matter is, you marry across some of these boundaries, and you discover that you have a great difference that has to somehow be negotiated. I keep forgetting to push this button. Sorry. I talked for a minute now about what it is that makes a marriage Christian. And I think, first of all, it is the understanding of marriage as a covenant that includes the choice to love and the choice to persevere in marriage. And may I point out that love is a choice? Okay, it's a choice. It has lots of emotions with it, but it's a choice. And it invites us to choose persistently to love the person we marry. Even if we don't feel very good toward them today or tomorrow. You keep choosing to love. And it's an interesting thing, because if you do that, your emotions will follow your mind at some point. Okay. And the other element that I think is very Christian, and I'm going to preach about this tomorrow if you're interested, but the matter of self-sacrifice. You know, self-sacrifice is the currency of good marriage. And I would remind us here tonight that conversion of a Christian removes self from the center of life. And it allows self to disappear from the center of life in a non-onerous manner. You know, it's not like, oh, rats, that left my life. I wish it were back, you know. Our feeling is that we are glad that troublesome self is not in the middle of the picture anymore. See? And notice that by self-sacrifice we emulate Christ. And I would remind us this evening that only the gospel can tame the human soul and produce self-sacrificial attitudes. See? Now, none of us do very well at this, okay, because we are because of sin, bent in upon serving our own interests. But the gospel calls us back to a self-sacrificial attitude, and I think these two things are what make Christian marriage: envisioning it as a covenant and also being caught up in a persistent life of sacrifice. See? Now a few minutes on marriage as a relationship. So marriage is an idea, it's a process. I want to talk about it as a relationship, because perhaps the most obvious thing about marriage is that it is the relationship between two people. And some elements of a relationship that make it workable and have to be managed, I think, are here on this little list. That, remember, love is volitional. You cannot require somebody to love you. See? Love is something you give to another person. And I think marriage as a relationship requires volitional love, the willing giving of love to another person. It's a process rather than an event, and tomorrow afternoon I'm going to talk about the progression of marriage. It goes through 4 stages at least that are interesting to know and understand. In a relationship there's also goodwill, and I could spend quite a bit of time talking about goodwill, and maybe I'll just spend a few minutes talking about it. You know, goodwill is this attitude of giving the benefit of the doubt to another person, because you conclude that they actually are not trying to undermine you and be devious. And in any relationship where goodwill exists, it's like oil in the transmission of life. When I was in college, I had a 1941 Chevrolet. I bought it for $200. I was pretty proud of that, and one day driving up the hill to the home where we lived, I began to hear noises underneath. It was quite a steep hill. And by the time I got up there, there was an unhappy rumbling. I ended up having to take out the transmission to discover that there's not enough oil in the transmission, And going up the hill, the oil had run to the back and had let the front bearing run dry and burned it out. I ended up having quite a job to do that because it was pretty hard to find a transmission that would fit a 1941 Chevrolet. But oil is a wonderful thing, and in a relationship, goodwill is the oil. That ladies, when your husband comes home late and you've had supper on the table, if you allow a stereotype, you don't assume, rats, he was just trying to make me miserable by showing up late. See? And gentlemen, I don't know the other example the other way, and I'll get myself in hot water if I keep playing with that. See? But you understand that goodwill is something that if it exists in a marriage, marriage works very nicely. If goodwill is gone, you don't want to be around. See? And we know how to generate goodwill when we're courting. We do all little nice things. Goodwill is generated by deeds that can only be interpreted as thoughtful deeds done out of a motivation of love. When a young man brings flowers or chocolates, see, the young lady thinks, he must have been thinking about me when I wasn't even around. See, remembering somebody on a birthday, holding doors, whatever it is. That in working marriages, goodwill is generated and is enjoyed. And it plays a valuable function because there are some days when in order to make yourself feel happy, you have to draw down the reservoir of goodwill because your spouse did something that caused you distress. And rather than throw them out, you take some goodwill and say, well, this is good. I'll use up some goodwill and we'll be fine. In relationships, communication has to be managed. And I think of all the areas written on about marriage, that communication probably tops them all. You can read all kinds of books on communication, but I boil it down very simply to two things: speaking and listening. That if you get married, you agree that you will speak and communicate with your spouse, especially on those subjects that produce resentment. And that's where discussion gets difficult. But if you're in a relationship and there's something that consistently produces resentment, you need to do something about that, because resentment will poison your relationship. And listening, of course, is a difficult thing to do because you have to leave off what you're doing to figure out what somebody else wants you to know. And most of us find that very inconvenient. Listening is hard work, but there are few things you can do that validate a friendship more than listening to somebody, even if you don't really care what they're talking about. See? When somebody listens to you, you start jabbering, don't you? And the more they listen, the more you talk. If we offered that to our spouses, it would be a marvelous thing. The management of conflict, we could talk a whole evening about that. How do you manage conflict? And I'm not going to get into that, except to say that you all have apparently done it because you're still alive. See? But how you do that in a relationship is an important thing, because if conflict does not get managed, then it blows up at some point. See? There's the interaction of personalities. How do personalities interact? Lots of things there. And also tenacity. You know, you think of friends you have even outside of marriage. Some of them require tenacity. You have to keep sticking with that person if you want to be a friend of them. And there's a little bit of that in marriage. You know, hopefully by the time you get married, you figured that out. But it is something that we need to learn to do on a consistent basis. Okay. That I am in this for keeps. So let's figure out how to deal with it, because nobody's going anywhere. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And then I dash on here, because I think time is moving along here, is that I think it's important to understand in marriage that there is a central dynamic that has to function. That if couples know what it is and they know how it works, their marriage will succeed. If they don't know what it is and don't know how to make it work, their marriage will fail. And I'm going to spend one session tomorrow afternoon talking about that, but I'll go over it quickly in case some of you are not going to be here. Understand that in marriage over time, a whole set of expectations that he has and a whole set of expectations that she has, they don't only meet each other, but they meet also a corresponding set of realities. Gentlemen, you thought your wife would have a hot meal on the table every night when you came home for supper. You get married and you're going to find out whether that's going to be true or not. See? And if it is true, you're a lucky man. If it's not true, what are you going to do about it? See? And so in many different areas of life we have these expectations. Many of them are not even, we don't even know how to say them because they are givens. We just assume that because Grandpa did it that way that it's going to be that way. Well, not always the case. See? And so the operative question in marriage becomes, how closely does what you imagined align with what you get? See? And those of you who've been married, you know that before you get married, you have only your imagination to go by. You are picturing in your mind what marriage will be like. But as you are married and live in a marriage, you will discover that there might be a difference between what you imagined and what actually exists. See? And so, working on a marriage involves discovering and balancing expectations against realities. And you know, if you have to move an expectation down, you sorrow, you grieve. If you have to move a reality up, that's work. If you have to adjust them both to the middle, then you have some of each of those things. But successful couples learn how to make this dynamic function. And sometimes it functions very quickly and issues are resolved, and sometimes it takes it takes a long time. Some things are not resolved, or that you don't learn how to manage them for 20 years. That's one of the realities. So I move quickly then to the nuts and bolts. I talked about expectations, and please realize that there are about 10 areas that surround marriage. If you picture marriage as a central core of ideas, the dynamics of which have to be managed, that around that are 10 areas of life, and I've listed them here: how you use leisure time, how you relate to family and friends, what you do about children and parenting. Money is the number one issue in American marriages, and I put 3 dimensions there: how was it earned, how was it spent, and what about debt? Those are 3 things that you need to learn to deal with. The whole subject of physical affection, of the dynamics of personalities, how communication takes place, how conflict is managed, the roles that you think husbands and wives should play, and also religion, the concepts, practices, and issues of conscience. See, that whether you know it or not, in all of those 10 areas you have a whole lot of expectations. Some of them are high-level expectations, some of them are low-level expectations. See, for example, I'm pretty sure none of you would marry if your spouse said, look, I'm happy to be your spouse for 364 days out of the year, but on that one day I want to go and spend it with my old flame. See, I doubt any of you would get married on that basis. See, now that's a high-level expectation, but a low-level expectation is something a little bit more humorous. And I play this little joke with some of my students. I tell them, I bet every one of you has an idea of whether or not the paper on a toilet paper roll should come off the top or the bottom. Okay? And not only that, I'll bet you've been in somebody else's bathroom and you fixed it so it's the right way. Okay? Yeah, see? And I'm not going to ask for any hands of confession here, see. Now, I think that would be a very low-level expectation. You know, nobody's going to have a big conniption over whether you turn the toilet paper roll around, see. So, you know, some of the expectations we bring to marriage are very high-order ones. It's a make-or-break thing. Others of them are very discretionary. And so, when I talk about the nuts and bolts of marriage, it means finding out how to live in each other's orbit with these differing expectations and adjusting them to realities so that life can be lived happily and ever after. One last thing here tonight, another component of marriage that's a very important one I would list as issues of conscience. And I list these specially because they are a category of marriage that I think we need to be very careful about. Because in marriage you cannot infringe on the issues of conscience that your spouse has without doing great damage to the relationship. See? And so I like to say that in marriage it is your privilege to live with your spouse's issues of conscience. So if you marry somebody who thinks that fish should not be eaten on Friday, and you do that knowingly, guess what you get to do for however long? You live in a household where there's no fish on Friday. Now I have 2 little caveats I want to make here, 2 provisions. Please understand that issues of conscience can be discussed. They cannot be overrun, but they can be discussed. You can say to your spouse, okay, so this is an issue of conscience with you. Can you help me understand why that is the case? And you can argue about whether or not that's a sufficient reason for it to be an issue of conscience, but you cannot contravene the issue of conscience. If your spouse is persuaded by your reasoning and adjusts the issue of conscience, then all is fair. The other one is that be very careful not to use an issue of conscience as a means of manipulation. See, in a marriage you can actually say to your spouse, well, for me that's an issue of conscience, when it's not an issue of conscience. But by putting it in the category of conscience, you can then manipulate your spouse and you can get your way. And I think all of us know from our own experience that manipulation is a sort of an atomic bomb. None of us like to discover that we have been manipulated or messed with, if I can put it that way. And so, if you have issues of conscience, please understand that they need to be legitimate and they need to be respected, but they cannot be used in manipulative ways. So, what I've done here tonight is I have one more slide, I think, here. You should wave at me, Dave. I guess you don't know when I've moved this, do you? So I keep. Two things that I think are very important: grit and the maintaining of goodwill. Those two things, I think, on a day-to-day basis are very, very important. So what I've tried to do here tonight is kind of fly over marriage and point out to you a big picture of marriage, what it is, what the key elements of it are, some of the details of it, and I think it's a valuable thing because we sometimes get buried in the details. We get myopic vision. We only see this thing here, and we need to see the whole thing. That marriage is a very complex relationship. It can be very, very enjoyable, or it can be very, very distressing. But if we look at it in all its details and we realize that there is a Christian component to it, marriage can be a great blessing. So I don't know if some of you have some questions. I don't know if there's a microphone. I'm willing to take some. If you have some personal questions about yourself, it's probably not a good place to ask them. And maybe what I should do, I see it's 8 o'clock. Maybe what I should do is just bring this to a conclusion. And if some of you want to talk, I'll stay by here for a few minutes and we can have some dialogue. And tomorrow I'm going to preach on the Christian aspect of marriage. And in the afternoon I'm going to talk about the central dynamic and the progression marriage goes through. And then we'll call it enough said. So. Am I going to close with prayer? Okay. So thank you for coming. If you want to visit afterwards, I'll be right down here. Father in heaven, thank you for an interested audience tonight. Thank you for marriage. Lord, help us in our understanding, for we suffer in life that we don't learn as quickly and as well as we should. But perhaps there's something said here tonight that will help someone in the formation of their ideas and help them in the living of their marriage. Thank you for the Sabbath, Lord. May we rest comfortably and we rejoice in the prospect of being together again tomorrow. And we thank you in Christ's name. Amen.